Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank, and we are going to discuss the news of the day. And there's all kinds of political news, but we're going to focus on just three topics today. The first one actually broke this morning. The OPEC, which stands for Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. I actually, after all this time, it's the first time I ever bothered to look that up. Anyways, they have made a decision. They've reversed themselves. President Biden had gotten Saudi Arabia and the other countries of OPEC to actually raise production to drive prices down, but now they're concerned that the prices are going down so too fast, and they have decided to knock down their production of petroleum by 2 million barrels a day. That is a lot of oil. That won't be going out onto the market. It may actually not be as catastrophic as it sounds. There are reasons that we can discuss about it, particularly as some of the smaller countries are not of OPEC are probably not going to be cutting back much. In fact, they're still trying to produce meet their goals of production, and they may continue to produce at the other rates for a while because they need money. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about that. But of course, it couldn't be worse timing for President Biden and the Democrats, especially if oil prices do go up. They did jump, especially here in California, although it's a temporary one because we don't have price regulation in California. Oil companies are allowed to gouge us in mere anticipation of the hurricane in Florida. Prices are expected to drop back off our huge increases of the past week in California, but elsewhere it's been creeping up about 15% actually over the past couple of weeks after like a couple of months of straight drops. And I don't expect that companies are going to want to lower their prices, although I think that is short term. I think they are actually not thinking long term, and I'll be happy to discuss that. But Dave, why don't you step in here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, setting the topic up the way you did. So it's interesting that a lot of people, when they first hear OPEC's cutting, 2 million barrels, it feels, oh my goodness, this is tragic. But like you said, I looked under the hood a little bit just to know for myself what that actually meant. And so it is the biggest cut in a couple of years. So that piece is significant. And in anticipation of an expected million barrel cut, prices had already risen about $7 a barrel. And once they made the announcement, it went up another $2. So depending on if you're talking West Texas Intermediate crude or Brent crude, the U.S. price is 88. UK 893, which means we're talking like somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10%, which is what I think what you said. But so why isn't it as important as people said? Well, it turns out that the quota levels for all of these countries, OPEC countries, were producing at about 3.6 million barrels a day less than their actual quotas were. Their production was much less than the quota for several of the countries, independent of the big three. So the big three are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. And so really, they're talking about the real impact being about what they were saying. And then, so the question is, number one, the U.S. impact. Did Biden's decision to slowly release extra oil from the strategic petroleum reserves, did that have an impact or any kind of significant impact? Did that distort the markets? And then this was sort of a political, pushback. And from what I've seen, it was not, the release was not a distortion of the markets. It was a signal, domestic political signal that really wasn't very economic at all. It was more for the domestic audience that's afraid of inflation. Didn't really impact the price.
And much, in fact, about 15 cents a gallon or something like that, possibly is what they said. So it did help.
So you're talking about gasoline.
Yeah.
You're talking about gasoline. Yeah. Okay. So what, in terms of the oil amount that was released, because just let's be clear, there's like three terms that get thrown around and sort of confuse people. One is oil, which comes out of the ground. One is gas, natural gas, which is sort of a byproduct. It's in the mix, and they separate them and they sell them separately. And then they refine the oil and they make finished products. And one of those finished products that used to just go out into the rivers as waste is gasoline. So gasoline is like this tiny little add-on on top of refining oil. When they refine oil, they make a bunch of products. And so one of the core products there is diesel. So in fact, there's actually a bigger, in terms of just product versus the number of things and the amount that you could sell it for, diesel is getting impacted more directly related to the oil price because it's not this byproduct that kind of just used to be waste. But anyway, what I was getting at is that they asked one of the members of OPEC, who's the Saudi representative there, and they asked him, is this political? Basically, did the U.S. try to distort the markets, and you're not, and now you're like fighting back? And his answer was, no, it didn't distort the market at all. Probably happened at the right time for America, and then if that didn't happen, then we would have been in a different situation today. We probably would have had to do something different. Where the economy, the world economy, might have been a little different. So he's basically people were saying this was an affront to Biden, but in fact, it was somewhat amenable. And then, so why did they do it? What was the big deal? And the big deal is this fear of recession. With the interest rate environment where we are, there is a high anticipation that we're going to face a recession. Now, some people are saying there'll be a soft landing. Other people say there might not be. But when you combine the interest rate hike with the Ukraine events and how Europe is about to phase in their complete cutoff of Russian oil and Russian refined oil products and gas, all three of those streams that I mentioned, all three of those product streams, that will actually affect the economy. Yes. So that will further make a recession likely because there are already industrial decisions being made in Europe to cut back on production, et cetera. So that there's this negative feedback loop that OPEC is anticipating that will reduce economic activity, reduce use of oil, and therefore the price would go down. So, compounding this is the strength of the US dollar. All the world is having a really hard time right now with their economies, but the US has a really strong dollar because we're the reserve currency of the world. So because oil contracts have to be denominated in US dollars, and among other things, US dollar, they're on reserve at all the Federal Reserve banks of all the countries around the world. So our dollar is actually at a very, very high level compared to all these other currencies. There was a recent, black swan event in Japan because their currency is weak. There was a recent sort of black swan event in the UK because people were questioning them doing a tax cut for the rich last week and their economy on the face of recession and this just being just bad. So there's been these huge economic, well, not huge. There have been significant economic shocks anticipating that we're going to have a recession. So really, OPEC, their claim is that this was a preemptive strike in anticipation of demand contraction, and the goal was to stabilize prices so that they can keep their profits in place. That's the justification.
Yeah, they're shooting to get it back up to $100 a barrel, and
exactly.
And that is absolutely their goal. I think they're making a big mistake here, because this is all that this news is doing. And every time they play games, and we see the American oil companies playing games with it too, where they don't have it, is all they're doing is hastening the point of time when we're going to be less dependent on oil. I mean, because there's now an off-the-scale market for electric cars. We've talked about that, and also alternative energy. The Germany's talking about firing back up its nuclear plants, right? And in terms of climate change, it's a better choice than coal or other things. So by doing this, they are going to jack up the demand, and even if there isn't a political will to create the infrastructure for cars around the country, there will be if people are demanding it, and only people in California and the West Coast have them, and here we don't care about oil prices. I mean, what's going to happen to the gas stations? This is a big mistake on their part, I think. I mean, in short term, sure, they're going to make more money. In the long term, I think they're cutting themselves in the foot. So that is a big issue. The question is, how does Biden handle this over the next month? He really can't step up and do any more pouring of oil into the economy from the reserves. It's not going to make that big a difference anyway. He can't make up for $2 million barrels a day. I think what he needs to do is, first of all, just forget about it. He tried to make a deal with Venezuela, which is an OPEC nation, but probably willing to buck the rest of it if it means they get money. And he needs to go back and deal with them. But the minute he did, he got slammed by Republicans for it. And he backed off it. He needs to go back and revisit that and just say, you know what, this is, if it's this important, if we got to deal with a brutal dictatorship of Saudi Arabia, we might as well deal with Venezuela, because this whole thing, Biden had backed off, pressing him on the murder on the of the journalists and other issues, and yeah, I think he needs to start putting the squeeze on Saudi Arabia, because there's nothing to lose now. Saudi Arabia has just completely bucked whatever promises he made to it. And if he shows that he's active in doing something about it, it'll be good, even if it doesn't have immediate results, because probably the prices of gas aren't going to go up that quickly anyway. As you said, some of the countries were having a hard time making the old quotas. They're probably going to make the same amount, so there isn't going to be a whole lot of difference in that. And we've also learned that gas prices have been dropping for 2 months, but it didn't have all that big of an impact on inflation, because the oil may not be quite at the core. Everybody says, it always is responsible for inflation because it's at the bottom. Everybody needs it. But it hasn't really lowered prices, even with gas lowering. So anyway, I think that it's not going to be catastrophic. I think the Democrats shouldn't panic. But I do think that Biden has to look like he's acting tough on it.
I think you he touched on several things that are really very relevant. And so one of them is Venezuela. You saw the evidence, the proof's in the pudding. Like, countries don't like to do these quid pro quos that are so overtly obvious, where they shake hands and then they do shady things.
Right.
So they happen. There's a delay between when one thing happens and another. And so there were oil executives that were in jail that were released in Venezuela as a gesture of goodwill from their part, which could be perceived as an overture of peace that would then precede Venezuelan production getting back online. And Venezuela, as a member of OPEC and with the largest reserves, then theoretically Venezuela could be a heavy hitter. So that could be some degree of stabilization.
And let me just interject too. I think it's the only OPEC nation in the Western Hemisphere. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it is. And so that could have relevance to the Western Hemisphere economy.
Mexico too. I just cheated.
Yeah,
I cheated. I looked at the map, so I didn't remember that either. So I don't feel bad. And it's OPEC plus, and so some countries are the plus, and so maybe they're part of the plus. It seems like they might be actually. Mexico's a plus. So anyway. With these, besides Venezuela, which is not an insignificant piece of the puzzle of why those three countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait, would agree to take a cut a little bit. In part, I think MBS in Saudi Arabia, he really is not super tight with Biden, as we know, because I expect he's anticipating not having to work with him for very long. That's just based on a lot of the things that we've seen over the last 2 years already, right? I mean,
yes.
Goes fast. But getting back to U.S. government response, because that's what this show is about. It's basically like, how is it affecting us, Americans, our families and colleagues and friends and peers and all that. The truth is, from what I've seen, not much can be done. Already producing the most oil we've ever produced, and we are right up there with Saudi Arabia. People say, depending on the year, we're like we are the other Saudi Arabia currently. So the question is, are we going to potentially increase production? And chances are no, because we're already, we're not doing that. And then are we going to limit exports of any of these products that other people would use? And no, we let our our companies export as they want to in this global market. So in a way, there's not really going to be, from a supply or demand side, from the industry side or the government side, there's not going to be a whole bunch. Biden's already passed, not him, but the administration and Congress has already passed the green energy future bill, the budget, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really has several streams going forward for the greening of the economy, which is the other thing you mentioned. And so the last thing I'll mention is that in that press conference, one of the journalists asked the OPEC, panel, 13 representatives up there in Vienna at the first in-person meeting since COVID. Basically, is this going to make poverty worse in the world? Are you trying to cause poverty in the world through this reduction, or directly or indirectly? And the UAE person's the one who answered, and they said, "Look, access to energy is important to us. Prices and poverty don't seem to be a problem in Europe and the United States because you guys just keep raising the prices, you keep raising the taxes. Your intention is you're not obviously not fighting poverty with your energy policy. So why are you asking us about your energy policy?" And then the other thing is you really need to worry about natural gas. So that's not what we do here. So we kind of deflected. But most importantly, what they said was really we're being proactive to avoid our market crashing. When you say you're going to transition to a green economy in the future, where will we be in 2024 and beyond? So this is really just us looking out for ourselves, and we're not trying to hurt people's lives.
So the consensus is it's probably not going to have a huge impact over the next month before the election.
I don't think we can assume that just because race is taken into account that necessarily creates an equal protection problem, because I understood that we looked at the history and traditions of the Constitution, at what the framers and the founders thought about. And when I drilled down to that level of analysis, it became clear to me that the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in a race-conscious way. That they were, in fact, trying to ensure that people who had been discriminated against, the freedmen, during the Reconstruction period, were actually brought equal to everyone else in society. When there was a concern that the Civil Rights Act wouldn't have a constitutional foundation, that's when the 14th Amendment came into play.
Okay, next topic. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, is hearing yet another Voting Rights Act case. We've been talking about this actually all year. There's a number of cases facing the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has agreed to hear these cases. So that's concern one. As to what they're going to do with it. The case that they debated yesterday as they opened up the arguments phase of a bunch of cases, this was Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's first time arguing. She made waves. We'll talk about that a little bit. But it's this is the case of Alabama. We've discussed during when we were talking about the gerrymandering that Alabama, not just this time around, but last time around, has basically it's a population of like between 30 and 40% Black people in Alabama, but they are the majority in only one of the 7 districts, the congressional districts. So basically, this is the way that Republicans can greatly limit the power of the Black vote, and therefore make sure that they get 6 Republicans out of it. Several organizations have sued to basically break that up. It's an octopus-shaped district that stretches into 2 metropolitan areas and splits them in half. And they, the hope is to create at least 2 Black majority or at least significant Black vote districts, and that would of course mean 2 Democrats and 5 Republicans, right? So so this is a political issue, and the state of Alabama has come right out and said, first of all, the fact that it's politically motivated doesn't mean it's racially motivated. We don't have anything against black people. We just want more Republicans in office, and there's nothing, again, there's no federal law or unconstitutionality about that. And second of all, if we do create 2 black districts, and we have any policy that's based on even advancing or reversing the discrimination, historical discrimination, that's race-based. And the Supreme Court has been taking a lot of cases saying even with the best of intentions, you cannot base a policy on racial discrimination, even good racial discrimination, because the 14th Amendment just says that that you have to treat everybody equally, right? And so basically, they've been taking the position that policies need to be colorblind, and possibly that the Voting Rights Act, because it calls for it actually calls for affirmative action to empower black voters, may be unconstitutional in their view. And so some of them are looking to completely overturn, completely destroy what's left of the Voting Rights Act. Ketanji Jackson came out really strongly and invoked originalism, which is usually used by conservatives, not always, but usually used by conservatives, to say, actually, the 14th Amendment came in the context of the 13th and 15th Amendment following the Civil War. And if you look at all of the legislative history about it, it was about righting these wrongs and not about colorblindness, but about addressing the inequality of, in particular, black voters, but in general, non-white voters. And very interesting, Gorsuch tried to argue with her, talking about computer-generated scenarios, blah, 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 but she wasn't having it. She went very strongly using a chief weapon of conservatism against itself. Granted, it hasn't always been used by conservatism. Originalism needs to be distinguished between strict construction, because liberals argue that original intent was to actually not have strict construction, that Madison was very clear about that, especially with regard to the Bill of Rights. So we need to distinguish between those two doctrines. But she isn't even arguing for a liberal interpretation of the Constitution. She's saying if you abide by originalism, which a couple of the justices claim they tend to be religious about almost, then you need to overturn this law and overturn the gerrymandering and allow for 2 districts in Alabama. She basically schooled the Alabama attorney, who was was apparently completely shocked that she kind of took the attack on this. But this is news for 2 reasons. The Voting Rights Act may be basically ruled unconstitutional and completely destroyed. Republicans used to take credit for having helped get that passed. In fact, there were more Republican voters in the North, than it was mostly Democrats in the South who opposed it, just the same as the Civil Rights Act. And now they're ready to basically bury it. The decision won't come until next year. But the other aspect of the news is she is there to make a presence and make a difference. I'll let you jump in there. I kind of went along.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Thanks. I mean, you covered a bunch of stuff, and I think we'll hit on some of those points over the time we've got left. And so just for rather than go bullet points, I'll just start at the top. So for context, this is Merrill versus Milligan. You described 27% of the citizens in Alabama are black, the voting citizens, but yet somehow they ended up with just 1 district when a reasonable person could easily imagine there be that were majority black. So the question is this map, if in effect, discriminatory? So what I think really is one of the more interesting parts is Alabama maybe in alignment with the more sort of a national way of framing the Voting Rights Act and voting in general, which is not based on the actual law, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and not based on what I would argue is the reality. But yet that's what they were promoting. Edmund LaCour, Alabama Solicitor General, he said that the law itself was only intended to cover and was meant to only cover intentional discrimination, and Alabama is taking a race neutral approach. So they were like making the pitch that you know what, the law, it's really just if we intended it to be that way, and in fact what our real intention is to not think about race at all, and that really should be how this goes. So in effect, the goal was to transform more broadly into a nation where race doesn't matter, where race doesn't have a protection in the Voting Rights Act. And the sort of the corollary to that, which I also think was really interesting, is that Justice Kagan, let's back up. Justice Roberts, when he voted to not take this case at all, he dissented in them taking this case because he said the lower court decided this case appropriately based on the law, and there are no apparent issues for our correction. An open and shut case. The map doesn't comply with section 2, right? Yeah. So
but this could end up being a 5-4 vote. Roberts is a moderate compared to
and Justice Kagan even said, like, look, we know that this is a slam dunk, that this case, this map is a clear violation, and so this is just an attempt to undo the Voting Rights Act. Like, so she called it out, actually, which I thought was pretty provocative. Although she's been doing interviews and she's been more provocative lately. So the idea is that this is, like I said, what I thought was interesting. You said you thought it might be a 5-4 case, which implies that there may be some folks on the some justices who are interested in defending the map. And so just looking at some of their language, I'll give you these quotes and I'll give you some feedback. I'll let you provide feedback. But the idea, Justice Roberts, this is a quote from him. He said, "My understanding of our cases is that you don't have to show intent," meaning you're wrong. And Justice Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett, said, "Our precedent and the statute itself says that you don't have to show discriminatory intent. So put that aside, like stop talking about it." And Justice Alito, he said, basically, it is a quote, "You have made a number of arguments, some of them quite far-reaching, adding that it would be better if they would focus on whether the voting district at issue was reasonably configured." So that's the tell here. That's the key, is that the justices are trying to steer Alabama back from the political grandstanding and actually trying to get them to make a legal argument about, hey, look, you could say that this map makes sense on its face without there being a discrimination as the cause of how we ended up with this map. And so that's where the justices are hoping that the arguments go. It sounds like from their oral arguments originally, the first day. And Kagan actually said, just to revisit her, she said that this is one of the great achievements of American democracy, but in recent years, the statute has not fared well in this court. So you and I could pick up on sort of some of the things that have chipped away at the Voting Rights Act a little bit down the road. But I'm curious for your feedback on that argument that the justices are really trying to steer these people maybe to protecting Alabama's map, but away from anything more than that.
Yeah, I mean, it would have huge political implications. I mean, let's remember, it's very interesting that Alabama is the first of these cases to come up. There are others coming up because for those who don't know the history, one of the most famous marches from Selma to Montgomery. Ironically, Montgomery is one of those places that splits in half, that they have to cut into it, and Selma, to create this octopus-looking district. And but this was a march for the Voting Rights Act. This was after the Civil Rights Act had been passed, and this was a violent march. George Wallace clamped down. People were injured badly. John Lewis was in it. It's also very interesting to study in terms of the difference between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the older, kind of more moderate organization, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by people including Stokely Carmichael. I mean, this was an iconic march, and for this to be overturned in Alabama, where it all began, would be huge, and we need to really understand the impact of this culturally and the rest. So I assume that the majority are aware of that, and yes, they will try to avoid language that suggests that the act itself is unconstitutional, but try to frame it in such a way that Alabama can do its thing without having that constitutional decision. But I don't know, because some of them are so extreme, they may demand it. They're gung ho. I mean, Clarence Thomas, with all the irony in that, just I think he's going to argue that the Voting Rights Act should be declared unconstitutional, which is really ironic, because when he was younger, he had cases and was involved in the championed that, but he has gone so far off the deep end that it's just hard to know where that's going to be. But I think Roberts definitely does not want the Voting Rights Act to be declared unconstitutional on his watch, so he will probably be lobbying Kavanaugh, who's like the most, right-wing other justice on there, is horrible as a person as he is, anyway, we don't have to go through all that, but this is really iconic on so many levels. This is the essence of the civil rights movement as it was drawing to close. This is, this is the time when Lyndon Johnson, when he was signing these acts, said, we, the Democrats, have lost the South for a generation, because it was 1968 that the Nixon Southern strategy was to basically blame the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts on the Democrats, and it started working. As of 1968 and after that, the majority of whites in the South voted Republican thereafter, every single time. And became even more pronounced to the point where it's something like 90% of whites in the South, not including Florida and Georgia, are Republicans. And so do they want to do this, though? Here the Republican Party is trying to attract Latinos. They've got their way into it. Do they want to take this this stand and basically overturn something as iconic as the Voting Rights Act, or do they do it without saying they're doing it? In which case, they also turn off some of the extreme right-wingers that really want to see this put to an end. They're tired of being under pressure to have to make sure that Black people have any say in politics in this country.
I mean, I would argue that there are already voting restriction bills getting circulated around the country, so there's not a demand on the Republican electorate side to stop that practice of trying to in effect marginalize people they disagree with, let's just say.
Right.
And Eric Holder,
see, when they're doing those, they just say, oh, but how hard is it to have an ID to do it? Anybody should be able to do it. And you're saying that Black people are stupid or incompetent to be able to get it to do that. They don't have any sense of nuance. So they're trying to argue that that's not discriminatory. But to overturn the Voting Rights Act, that's
right. Yeah. And so Eric Holder, who this is a pet project of his, former Attorney General under Barack Obama, he actually came out again, because this is his pet project, his topic that he fights for. He said, really, the law is a question of impact, and so it's not. It couldn't be more obvious that you have an impact that is disparate when a reasonable border would have 5 and 2 versus 6 and 1, and that's, you're basically getting half the representation. So that the impact itself, and he said if you extrapolate that out, this is just the Alabama, not just, but this case is exclusively talking about the Alabama map. But if you then said, well, as long as it looks reasonable, then you could do anything. Then that would be allow for similar districts around the country, preventing citizens from having the representatives of their choice. So there is an impact that can be identified, and so we'll see how good the solicitor is at making that case to these justices.
I stayed silent as the atrocities committed against my mom were downplayed. I stayed silent when it came out that my father, Herschel Walker, had all these random kids across the country, none of whom he raised. And you know my favorite issue to talk about is father absence. Surprise, because it affected me. The abortion card drops yesterday. It's literally his handwriting in the card. They say they have receipts, whatever. He gets on Twitter. He lies about it. Okay, I'm done. Done. Everything has been a lie.
Okay, on to the Senate. We have discussed the Senate and the elections and the chances of each party taking the Senate over the past few months. We've discussed how it went from a more than 50% chance that the Republicans would claim the Senate to lean Democrat. 538 has had it up to 71 chances out of 100. It's backed off though in the past couple of weeks. I believe it got as low as 66 out of 100. I don't want to say as low. I mean, it's still pretty high, and it's back up to 67 today, probably because of the Herschel Walker news that we'll get into in just a minute. But the races have been tightening. The Democrats had been ahead in polls. Wisconsin, Barnes had been out in front. It shocked everybody that he was out in front, but Ron Johnson and the Republicans have been throwing a lot of racially charged ads, hitting him on his prior defund the police stand, and it has apparently taken a toll. The polls are roughly even right now, and Fetterman, concerns over his health, whether or not the stroke is more serious than he's letting on, and the fact that he's only doing one debate has been used against him. Oz has cut down the lead, although Fetterman is still outside the margin of error in most of the polls, and he's hitting back hard. So we'll see what goes on, but we probably knew it. We probably should have known that these races were going to tighten because a lot of money is going to be spent on these ads and the like. And there was an article this morning. I'm forgetting what Politico, might have been Politico or The Hill, that says, "Will Democrats be disappointed again in North Carolina?" Well, 4 months ago, even 3 months ago, there was nothing to be disappointed in. Everybody just assumed that the Democrats were going to lose in North Carolina. So the fact that article even exists, it shows you that this is still a big horse race. And of course, the biggest news of the Senate came is Herschel Walker running against incumbent Raphael Warnock in Georgia, which is a reddish, more sort of a maroon state, maybe not quite purple because it still has a lot of right-wing influence. But as we've discussed, the Atlanta metropolitan area continues to grow and change the electorate, and the black vote is motivated. However, in the governor's race, Stacey Abrams, running once again against Kemp, is behind outside of the margins of errors in most polls, within the margin of error, but not ahead in any polls. And yet Warnock, from the exact same pools, is doing much better. And that is because the Republicans have nominated a very problematic candidate in the great running back Herschel Walker, football hero. But the problem is he has got a lot of historical issues, and we've talked about how he's been accused of holding a gun to his ex-wife's head and threatening to kill her. He doesn't even deny it. He says, "I used to struggle from mental health issues, but I'm all better now." And now it turns out that of his 4 children that he has with 4 different women, he also apparently paid for Daily Beast claims they have the paperwork that shows that he paid for an abortion for a girlfriend. And this prompted his conservative son, Chris Walker, to go on Instagram and go viral, and is now all over the media slamming his father. He's not a liberal, by the way. He is conservative, and saying, "I'm done. He's been an absentee father. He didn't do anything to raise, me or help my mother, And it was just this is the last straw." But in the meantime, Republicans are doubling down because they don't have any choice. They're attacking the media, attacking Democrats. Democrats probably did. This is an October surprise. I'd be surprised if they had nothing to do with this. I don't know, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean it's false. It means they had the evidence. So Herschel Walker, anyways, in one poll is down 3 points. I believe that was. I'm forgetting which one it is, but another one, he's down 12 points, Survey USA, which is rated A by 538. And if you look closely at all of the figures, I'm going to come up with a theory as to there's a couple reasons, but why Raphael Warnock is doing much better than Stacey Abrams in the same pool of voters, of likely voters. But I have talked a while, so Dave, I'm going to let you jump in here.
Yeah, no, again, yeah, as usual, you gave me a great setup here. And I think the big picture takeaway is, as you said, we are now 4 weeks out. And this is why people talk about an October surprise. This is, people know, campaign strategists and political action groups know this is when you get the most bang for your buck. This is when people start paying attention who have not paid attention. So depending on what state you live in, you just are getting inundated with ads, so much so that it's like torturous, I would say. Just from my past experience, we don't have that here in California as much, right. but certainly other states do. And so the combination of just the timing, but also the money. The last statistic I remember reading was that about 10 years ago, there was about $5 million in dark money, but then Citizens United came along and got traction. And now in the last cycle, 2020, there was $1 billion in dark money. So there's just so much cash looking for a way to just, for lack of a better word, just like barf out any sort of persuasiveness that they've got. And they do interest groups and they do research groups and polling tests, and they figure out what really freaks people out, and that's what they go with. So it just gets really, the mud slings during this time period. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing more and more of that. That said, now let's be more clinical. Just as a practical matter, the Democrats started from a very weak position, and as the economy improved a little bit, as there was a little bit more effectiveness in the legislature, people were less offended. So many people were probably thinking to themselves, anything but this, like whatever we've got is terrible. But as things started improving a little bit, maybe people settled back in a little bit to their lanes, and so that's. In theory, that started the process of Democrats picking up some traction, but then the Roe v. Wade getting overturned, that woke people up. The evidence in the Kansas primary race, where they had a constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to revoke the rights for abortion out of their constitution and make it illegal statewide. People who had never voted before went out and registered. Lots of independents went out and registered. So it's one case does not prove the rule, but it just shows that you do agitate formerly sleeping voters, apathetic voters, and you make them interested voters. So I think that's what's in play right now, is that both parties are trying to drum up traction from their base to get the turnout sufficient to overcome any changes at this phase or this stage beyond what they could predict or what they could influence. And so, like you said, the Senate, 538 has the Senate as getting a little bit tighter, I guess, because of just this trend reversion back to the mean, so to speak. But they still do show the likelihood is that the Republicans are going to not have enough to take, that it'll end up being 51-49. That's still what it appears, but there's some individual cases like you referenced. Herschel Walker's case, that just seems like it's not going to go Republicans' way. It doesn't seem like there's as far as I'm concerned, people think right-minded folks probably will not choose him as their senator. And so just pick another state that you highlighted, Fetterman. I think Fetterman took a hit when he had a stroke, and when he came back out after kind of not being out in the public eye for a while, it was clear he wasn't fully articulate. He hadn't fully recovered. And I think that he took, just sort of a hit to the plausibility of his candidacy based on that. So that race is tightening, but it's still the case that Oz has huge obstacles to overcome. And we could hit some others, but I'll let you give some feedback on that general prognosis.
Well, like I said, I still think there's a factor that just for whatever reason, pundits, including 538, don't want to discuss, and that is that women are registering, and young women are registering in record numbers. And well, are they going to actually turn out? Well, they've turned out in the special elections. We've discussed that the Democrats have overperformed in all of the special elections in terms of the polls. They haven't won them all, but they've done better than the polls up to 5 or 6 points in every single election. So and for some reason that's not factoring into anybody taking it seriously. Oh, those young women, they don't vote. Well, I don't think they would go to the trouble to register if they're not going to vote, and I don't think their votes are going to be swayed and say, "Oh, gosh, the price of gas might go up. I don't care about abortion anymore. I'm going to vote for the Republicans because it's just not going to happen." And so until I see some discussion of that and how it's impacting the polls and whether or not the pollsters are altering their likely voter analysis, I still think that it's the Democrats to lose. Now they can lose it. They've done it before. Snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory is something that they have mastered for decades now. But I think that when we're looking at these polls, and it was the poll I was thinking of, Insider Advantage has tended to be more conservative in its polls. They're rated B by 538, and they messed up. I don't want to say messed up, but they were off in the Georgia elections in 2020 by 2 and 3 points with Ossoff and Warnock in the runoffs in January, where the both Democrats outperformed those polls before. So they're like one of the few pollsters that doesn't really get it right in Georgia. And they had Walker ahead by 3 points in early September, which when all the other polls had Warnock ahead. And now they've got Warnock ahead by 3 points, and this is being touted as, well, it's within the margin of error, so the race must be tightening. You can't gauge it by, comparing one poll to another. You got to compare one poll. Warnock has gained 6 points since early September in that poll. Why? And this is even before really most of it. I mean, I think maybe the last day or two of that polling was about this abortion revelation. But in the meantime, the Survey USA poll, as I said, has them ahead by 12. I want to bring something up here before we go on to other states, is that I'm looking at, if you go to 538, you can look at the percentages, and there are a lot of people who are undecided or voting for third party or not indicating that they're going to vote for Warnock or Walker. I think it's something like 9% in the Senate race and 4% in the governor's race. More people have made up their mind in the governor's race. Fewer people are voting for the Libertarian. They've made up their mind, and there are a lot of Republicans out there who've said, you know what, I'm going to vote for Warnock, but I'm going to vote for Kemp. And so. But I think there's an element here that is going to be interesting for Republicans in the future, because I think there's still an element. Georgia is a southern state. It's changing, but it is a traditional southern state. We've talked about in the last segment about its history of racism and the white vote. I think there's an element, maybe only 2 to 3% of the Republican vote, who will not vote for a black candidate, even if he's as crazy as they are. I mean, I just, that's they just will not do it. And this may be the last time, at least for quite a while, that you see the Republicans choose a black candidate for a statewide position in a southern state. I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have experience to speak to the last element that you brought up is, like the double thought process that goes into Republicans when they determine a candidate. Are they going to say, well, are we going to put in an African American person because we want to be able to X? Like, I don't know how much of that actually happens or what goes into that, but basically the Trump effect here was Trump basically, Herschel Walker used to play football on a team that Trump owned, New Jersey Generals. And Herschel Walker is very popular in Georgia because of college football success, one of the greatest running backs in University of Georgia history. And I really think that Trump, the same thought process, we'll call it, the same methodology that went into Trump supporting Dr. Oz because he's on TV, because he's famous, that I would argue that you're right in that sense, that there's pretty much no reason to pick a celebrity just because they're a celebrity.
Right.
Not a strong candidate. And obviously
But
Oz
Trump
has zero experience.
But Trump likes celebrities.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. So that I'm agreeing with you in that sense, that that's a really sort of poor way to roll with this. But one thing I'm going to say too is that more just sort of a different tack on that same thought process about racial identity politics. I saw an article the other night where North Carolina is really in play, and that in fact about 50% of the white voters in North Carolina were not born in North Carolina. It's actually a destination state for jobs and opportunity. So there's an importation of basically socioeconomic status liberal, high socioeconomic status liberals or some other set of people from outside the state that might not have a Southern relationship with their, how they deal with their own in-state Republican Party and candidate history. So anyway, it's interesting to just think about that piece of it. Florida, you could argue the same thing. Florida's probably got a ton of people not born in Florida. And I know we only have limited time left, but it really is very close, despite the fact that 538 says it's about 2 out of 3 chances that Democrats take the Senate. Some of those races that are leaning towards Republicans right now may not go that way, and the same must be true in the other way. So there's probably a half a dozen at least races that we'll still keep following in the coming weeks, waiting for another October surprise.
Well, Democrats might do well in North Carolina as long as none of them are stupid enough to say that parents don't have a say in education. But we'll cover that another time. But in the meantime, we are done with this segment. All right, this brings us to our predictions. Dave, what have you got for us?
This week, I'm going to speak to the Senate race in Georgia, and the latest revelations, the scandal, you could call it, surrounding Herschel Walker as a candidate and as a flawed human being. This might just be a little too much for Georgia Republicans to swallow. His son came out recently with, as you mentioned in our prior segment, revelation that from his opinion, Walker's not conservative. He's not religious. He's not a family person. He's not a nice person with lots of variety of potential negative parenting techniques, etc., domestic violence, etc. It just seems like it's just the drip has now led to a little bit too much to overcome. If you look at the polling of likely voters in Georgia, one of the more admirable and accurate polls historically just shows him drop off a cliff to the point where his support now is down to 38%. Say they're going to vote for him, which is a 12-point gap. That 88% who are saying they know what they're going to vote for still leaves the 12% undecided. So it could still go the other way. But when you look at this mapped out, it looks like his popularity is falling off a cliff. And I'm going to call my prediction is that Warnock takes this one, and I don't think it's going to be that close.
All right. I'm going to be very quick. Oregon, the governor's race. It's not looking good for the Democrats, and I'm actually predicting that Republican Christine Drazan is going to win it. The reason being is that Democrat Tina Kotek is, not all that bad a candidate, but independent former Democrat Betsy Johnson is splitting the vote. In the latest poll I saw, she had 19% of the vote, with Drazan ahead, I think by 1 or 2 points, both of them in the 30s. It's not done yet. There may be a time when a lot of people in Oregon who might have been voting for Betsy Johnson will move away, but we're in October now, and still almost just about 20% of the people and mostly Democrats willing to let their vote be split, unless something changes drastically there. It'll be a weird event, but Republican will be the governor of Oregon. So it's my first Republican prediction of the season. I'll probably have another one soon, but I want to see how the polls go. But anyway, that takes care of this week's show. We'll be back next week to discuss some of these issues and some that we didn't get to. So until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.